Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world. So today, we're going to use a novel, Pierce Brown's Morning Star, as a kind of blueprint. We'll use it to understand something that's, incredibly complex, how a whole society, a rigid social system, can just collapse. And maybe even more importantly, what it takes to build something new from all that rubble. Okay, so first things first. Before we can talk about collapse, we have to understand this system itself, right? What are the rules, what's the structure, and what's the glue holding this whole thing together? Right at the very top of this pyramid, you've got the Golds, and their whole worldview, their whole society is built on this one core idea, a myth of genetic superiority. They don't just see themselves as rulers, no. They truly believe they are the peak of evolution. And for them, power isn't something you're given. It's something you take by force. So the system itself is this super rigid pyramid, a caste hierarchy, where every color has a very specific job. You have the red miners way down at the bottom and the gold rulers up at the top. But here's the key factor for us, the thing that's really shaking things up. There's a rebellion. And it's not just one group. It's a coordinated effort that cuts across all these made-up divisions. And this is where it gets really interesting, because how do they maintain control? Well, it's not just about brute force, with the gray soldiers and obsidian enforcers. That's part of it, for sure. But it's also economic. They give the lower colors just enough to survive, so they're totally dependent. It's social. Everyone is locked into their role from birth. And maybe most importantly, it's philosophical and psychological. They create this deep-seated belief that the hierarchy is not only right, but noble. And that the real danger isn't the system, it's the people who question it. All right, so now that we've got a handle on the system, let's look at the incentives at play. Because this is really the core of the conflict. What drives someone to defend the system to the death? And what drives someone else to risk everything to tear it all down? This is where we start to see the cracks forming in the foundation. This slide just lays it out so clearly. You have these two completely opposing logics. On one side, the elites are all about maintaining dominance, using coercion and enforcing that strict hierarchy. But the insurgents? Well, they can't play that game. They can't win with brute force alone. Their only path to victory is to build something different, legitimacy and trust, across the very divides that the elites created. They have to swap out all that aristocratic rivalry for actual unity. And you know what? Here's the fatal flaw baked right into the system. Even among the Golds themselves, the number one driver is personal power. They don't really unite for a shared cause. Instead, they just attach themselves to whoever's the strongest star at the moment. But what happens when that star starts to fade? Well, their loyalties completely fracture, and that creates the perfect opening for their enemies. So, to fight against all that raw power, the rebellion needs a different kind of weapon, something stronger. And that weapon is trust. It literally becomes their most valuable strategic asset. Think about it. Trust is the currency that makes it possible for a low-red miner, a giant obsidian warrior, and even a disillusioned gold to stand side by side and fight for the same thing. So, what happens when these two completely opposite ways of thinking finally collide head-on? Well, the outcome is almost inevitable, a predictable, cascading failure of the entire system. And this brings us to the central metaphor we're going to use for this whole collapse. I want you to picture the hierarchy as this massive, massive dam. All those internal power struggles we talked about, those are cracks forming in the concrete. And as those cracks get wider and wider, the control mechanisms, the armies, the economic dependency, they just start to fail. And all that pressure from the rebellion that was being held back, it's not contained anymore. It just surges through the entire system. And this collapse doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds in pretty clear stages. First, you see the elite fragmentation. The great gold houses turn on each other, fighting for scraps of power. Then, a massive legitimacy crisis hits when the sovereign is killed. Suddenly, nobody knows who's in charge. In all that chaos, loyalties realign. Armies and fleets start looking for the next big power player to back. And then the final step. The central military, the Gold Armada itself, just chatters. It can't maintain order anymore. And this is the moment the dam doesn't just crack, it bursts wide open. The Jackal's big gambit. He reveals he has nukes hidden on Luna, the very center of gold power. And with that one move, the last illusion of centralized authority is just gone. The collapse isn't some abstract idea anymore. It's real, it's catastrophic, and there is no going back. But here's a tricky thing about systems. Even when they completely shatter, the pieces don't just vanish into thin air. Power has this weird kind of inertia. The ghost of the old order keeps echoing, long after it's officially dead and gone. Which really makes you wonder, right? If the whole system is broken, if its authority is a joke, why doesn't it just disappear? Why don't people just immediately jump on board with the new reality? Well, there are a few really powerful reasons. First off, there's just plain fear. The chaos of a revolution can be terrifying, and sometimes people prefer the oppression they know to an unknown future. Then you have nostalgia. You get these powerful figures trying to sell a romantic, fictionalized version of the past, claiming the old order was the only thing that kept humanity safe. And finally, you get power vacuums. With no central authority, all these little gold warlords pop up, trying to carve out their own fiefdoms from the rubble. So you see, the battle on the grid starts to transform into a battle for hearts and minds. It becomes a true crisis in perception. The real war is no longer just about ships and armies, it's about the narrative. It's this massive struggle to convince everyone that the old system is really truly dead, and that this new thing, this new society, is legitimate, stable, and worth believing in. And that leads us right into our final section, looking at the incredibly difficult, messy process of actually building a new structure from the ashes of the old one. And what a journey it is. I mean, think about the scale of it. It starts with these secret, fragile alliances forged in dark tunnels, and it ends with the public, official dismantling of the entire color hierarchy that defined their world for centuries. It's that massive shift from being a rebellion to actually having to govern. But building that new authority isn't magic. It takes real, concrete steps. You absolutely have to get the military on your side, which means uniting people who were trying to kill each other yesterday. You have to physically tear down the old institutions, get rid of the Senate, the Board of Quality Control. You have to create a new system of justice. And you have to do all of this while you're still fighting off the last remnants of the old guard. And this is really why using this story as a model is so powerful. Because it perfectly mirrors the challenges we see in real-world history, that struggle for legitimacy, the way old power structures refuse to die, the sheer difficulty of building new institutions from scratch. These aren't just fiction. They're the universal dynamics you see in any real revolutionary transition or post-authoritarian restructuring. Which leaves us with one last and pretty tough question to think about. When everything has fallen apart, in that chaotic aftermath, what's the single most critical thing you need to build a stable society? Is it justice? Is it security? Or is it creating a new, shared vision that everyone can rally behind? Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a longer audio-based analysis of this topic, see the deep dive linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.